Welcome back, everybody. So this video is way too long, so I'm just going to jump into the 2000s. Oh, and just a quick warning, there's some not safe for work content in this PG-13 rating, so that aside, let's go. At first glance, the first decade of the 21st century doesn't seem to have much to offer. Obviously, not much can top the 80s with its list of fandom and fiction firsts. However, despite the decade being known for the start of the still ongoing War of Terror and all the fear it caused, the 2000s saw the introduction of 30 new conventions in contrast to only 13 new conventions in the 90s. As the fandom grew, the fiction also still managed to achieve several milestones in the 2000s. Now, the first mainstream furry video game was obviously 1991's Sonic the Hedgehog, even though, to be fair, certain games with furry protagonists preceded Sonic, such as 1983's arcade classic Mappy. However, the first furry video game exclusively aimed at adults is largely forgotten today. That milestone would go to Conker's Bad Fur Day. Released on March 5th, 2001 in North America, the game could be described as a shock comedy parody of popular platformer games at the time such as Super Mario 64 and Crash Bandicoot. What many don't know is that the game is a sequel to the 1999 rated E Conker's Pocket Tales. Originally, Conker wasn't an adult game. However, as development went on, the market quickly saturated as Mario 64 clones dominated the platformer market. Eventually, an artist employed with Rare, Chris Seavor, who had an idea for a game called Bad Fur Day that featured Conker trying to help others but causing more problems in doing so as well. He also wanted the game to be, quote, edgy in terms of violence. As the writing progressed, the game took on elements that were common to adult animation at the time, such as sexual humor and reference-based humor that played off of the Gen X pop culture imagination, such as references to Star Wars, Apocalypse Now, and Jaws. It ultimately was reviewed well but sold poorly. Now, the second big 2000s furry fiction milestone was a more ignorable one than Conker's Bad Fur Day, if you can believe it, it being the very first that I can tell fictional TV show to portray the furry fandom. Yes, CSI's infamous 2003 episode Fur and Loathing. I'll try to spare most of the grisly details and try to focus more on the fandom reaction / involvement. So, in summary, the episode is about the murder of a male furry who fursuits as a raccoon persona in Las Vegas. Obviously, the thing that everyone remembers about this is the fact that the fictional furry convention in the episode was portrayed as little more than being about public sex and lectures. Although, to be fair, there has been documented public sexual stuff at furry conventions for a bit. Obviously, being a part of the furry fandom is much more than sexual activities, as there are even furries who claim to be completely non-sexual. Of course, the furry fandom at large showed disapproval at their portrayal of the fandom, especially in light of being told by a somewhat famous fur, Dark Fox, aka Saber Fox, what happened when he was hired as a consultant of sorts. In short, Dark Fox was hired to invite local furries to be extras in the episode as well as review the script, but after noticing that many extreme sexual aspects of the fandom were highlighted, which he thinks was sourced from an MTV show called Sex 2K, which had a furry episode, as well as many errors and misconceptions. In the end, Dark Fox's suggestions fell on deaf ears and the episode we know today was born. In the end, fandom reaction of the episode was obviously negative and has a legacy of giving furries a bad name, which can be compared to the negative reputation that the 1982 film Mazes and Monsters gave to Dungeons & Dragons players. A somewhat famous furry, Ursula Vernon, commented at the time, quote, "I really don't blame the show for taking the weirdest possible angle, because if I were writing the show, I'd do it too. Why? Because a bunch of weirdos in costumes writhing around to porno music is way better for the ratings than an hour of slightly geeky people in t-shirts with wolves on them arguing about whether The Lion King was a better movie than Watership Down. Ultimately, I think the episode is best forgotten." Lastly, the third big milestone that many tend to forget that occurred during the 2000s was the slew of webcomics that came out. Seriously, name your favorite furry webcomic and it probably originated in the 2000s. House Pets, Lackadaisy Cats, Two Kinds, Circles, and other famous comics I probably forgot started then. A lot of this has to do with the explosion of internet usage as well as digital art tablet usage in the 2000s, but also probably in the rise of home video, making furry cartoons available to all ages. After that, yeah, not too much happened in the 2000s in terms of historically important furry fiction. Fandom-wise, both furaffinity.net, which I believe is still the largest social furry art gallery on the web, and WikiFur launched in 2005. I mean, Something somewhat notable is in 2009, Wes Anderson's Fantastic Mr. Fox dropped, arguably being, if one doesn't count the 1978 adaptation of Watership Down and the 1982 adaptation of The Plague Dogs, the first furry art house film. Now, why is it an art house film, you might ask? Well, besides the fact that it's made by Wes Anderson and that his films are considered art because of their highly stylized look, I mean, just look at how Mr. Fox looks. Pretty much everywhere throughout the movie. How's this not art? Anyway, besides the aforementioned briefly stated, the film is a serious example of one Fox's midlife crisis as well as relationship with his family. It's very well done, and I highly recommend watching it, as well as Cardinal West's analysis video for it. Giving thanks for Fantastic Mr. Fox. Anyway, in conclusion, the 2000s came to a close with a recession, and with it, less of a chance of seeing films like Fantastic Mr. Fox and seeing films more like Iron Man due to the franchise tentpoles being less of a financial risk. However, much great furry fiction was around the corner. Now, anyone who remembers the early 2010s and was on the internet at the time, especially if you're Gen Z or Millennial, remembers the rise of the Brony fandom. For those who don't know, the fandom is identified as being the adult fandom of the children's show My Little Pony: Friendship is Magic, which first aired on The Hub, a successor to the Discovery Kids channel in the US. Initially, adult interest in the show was among hipsters who watched the show ironically, since the franchise was seen as something just to sell toys, but as more adults watched it, interest online spiked, especially due to the sites like Equestria Daily, which started in January of 2011. The show ran itself for a total of 9 entire seasons, from 2010 to 2019, and gathered quite a following. I remember reading somewhere back in the 2010s, I think it was on TV Tropes, that at a certain point the show had more fan art for it than Marvel and Star Wars combined or something insane like that. Also, the fandom had a massive fan labor to its name, such as voice-acted 9-hour Ace Attorney and My Little Pony crossover video series, Fallout Equestria, which was a massive fanfic, which can be described as a mini-fandom of its own, with many side stories and sequels and derivative works, and numerous fan animations and fan music I'm not even going to go into. Lastly, many celebrities identify themselves as bronies over the run of the show, such as William Shatner, who starred in the show, Andrew WK, Broadway actress Lena Hall, and even Gabe Newell identified as bronies. So, in other words, Friendship is Magic and bronies were a very big deal. I even remember hearing statistics somewhere that at the height of the show, something like every 1 in 20 people in the world was a brony, which is amazing. However, as the show went on, many became bored with it, and with their newfound interest in anthropological fiction, decided to go into fandoms that feature furry characters. Because of their access to the internet and their intimate knowledge of how to use it, it wasn't long before they discovered franchises like Five Nights at Freddy's, Undertale, Zootopia, and even Hazbin Hotel. And although many of these people are still part of these fandoms, many people have recognized through their choice of the aforementioned fandoms and other works of fiction that they have a perennial interest in fiction that features anthropomorphic animals. Later in the 2010s, many would discover furries through apps such as TikTok, but for me, it was doing wiki hopping and exploring fan art on sites like Pinterest and DeviantArt. However, it can be safely said that of all these works of fiction that transitioned people best from furries to bronies, Zootopia is the #1 culprit. It came at a time several years after many left the brony fandom either because they had become, like I just said, bored of the series or disillusioned from both the letting go of the creator, Lara and Faust, the show becoming more marketed at its target demographic of little girls with the induction of Equestria Girls and the concept of Princess Twilight. The film also came around the time that the Undertale fandom was slightly dying down 1 year after its release, so really its timing could not have been more perfect. As for the film itself, as of the writing of the script, July 2022, at grossing over $1 billion, it ended up becoming the second highest grossing original film ever, as it is not a sequel, prequel, reboot, nor an adaptation of any fictional work. The film is also Disney's second longest film, clocking at 108 minutes, with Fantasia being their longest film. The film is also a historical milestone in its use of animation. The film probably has a record for most characters in a CGI movie. There are about 400 unique species and costume setups in Zootopia, with over 800,000 unique potential characters in total. The film, I'm pretty certain, also has a record for most hairs animated in a CGI film, with just one mouse character having more hair than Elsa in Frozen. In fact, several new software programs were created to animate the film, such as iGroom, which helps digitally brush the fur in the film, as well as a program I couldn't find the name for that controls wind in ways that have never been done before that film came out. One last interesting thing about Zootopia is that it's possibly the first furry movie to be advertised to, well, furries. According to a 2016 BuzzFeed article, one example of this include a marketing agency working with Disney to send messages to, quote, furry meetup group Fur Life, encouraging furries to post photos of themselves in fursuits to Twitter and Instagram with the movie hashtag. There's also the theory that the movie has built-in marketing for furries throughout the film.
Hey, no kiss, bye-bye for daddy?
Yeah, probably just a string of coincidences, yeah. Anyway, as for anything else in the 2010s, the Sonic Archie series concluded in 2017, and one of my favorite video games of all time, Major Minor, came out in 2015, which is definitely a furry game, as you can see. Oh, and before I conclude talking about this decade, it's important to note there was a furry anime explosion after Zootopia was released. Sure, there was some furry anime before Beastars, but that was few and far between, like Wolf's Rain and Egret Soko, which was conceived before Zootopia was released and released alongside Zootopia. However, in September 2016, months after Zootopia was released, a manga by Paru Itagaki was released about a high school of anthropomorphic animals that dealt with a conflict between carnivores and herbivores. Its anime adaptation, which released in 2019 Netflix, seemed to be the anime that ignited the anime furry revolution, which can still be seen in this decade with the release of furry anime such as BNA, Brand New Animal, and Odd Taxi. All in all, the 2010s was just a great time to be or become a furry because it's arguably when the fandom and fiction became mainstream because of all the aforementioned works of fiction. I also feel that the rise of the anime fandom really helped to make furries mainstream, so there's so much crossover. This was also the time that millennial furries who grew up on the Disney Renaissance came of age and were able to make their own stuff. However, despite the challenges and tragedies of the next decade, the furry fandom would press on. So, despite the severe economic and social impact of a severe lockdown dominating the identity of the decade, as well as several other crises, the 2020s have been surprisingly fruitful in their output of furry fiction. Obviously, one of the sole mainstream hits has been The Bad Guys, which is DreamWorks' reimagining of the heist genre with anthro characters. I found the film's plot and characters to be well written, and I love the animation. Beyond this, as much as I love it, it's not really a historical film apart from the fact it was arguably the first American post-lockdown animated blockbuster, and the fact it has the longest one-shot in DreamWorks animation history at 2 minutes 25 seconds and at 7 frame rates. But as for the indie stuff, as much as the comics have been performing well, I have noticed that in particular there have been an explosion in the development of furry games. There are a lot of excellent looking indie furry games that are being released later this decade, such as Mars Vice, Brock the Investigator, Mercury Abbey, Billy Bustup, and Como Remby. In fact, as of the writing of the script, Rick Griffin, the creator of House Pets, is working on an indie game, while a furry-ish game called Stray is selling well and trending on the internet. So yeah, there's furry games everywhere. With 8 years left in the decade, and so much creative output despite the fact that the world pretty much came apart in almost every way in the last 2 years, it's a safe bet to say that things will remain creative. Given the fact that most of Gen Z as a whole remains young, unmarried, and ambitious, the fact that they can use the internet so well and use it so often, and have all these great works of furry fiction to experience almost instantly and at low prices, the 2020s could just be a furry fiction golden age. But as for now, all we have to do is relax and enjoy the show. Furry fiction went from being the subject of extremely simple stories and mythology to being the subject of computer-generated films that constantly push the envelope to see what's technologically possible. It went from being an offshoot counterculture to being a countercultural subculture. Really, the only question for furry fiction is, where to next? I see so much philosophical potential in the pseudo-genre, especially questions related to bioethics, what it means to be human, identity, and more. Some of the potential of genres like cyberpunk and biopunk. We might never get a furry Hamlet or Dune, but as I've explained, that Gen Z is far more active in furryism, we could definitely continue to get great stories. One direction I'd like to see furry fiction to go is that of mainstream popularity. I want to see something mainstream cool. Furry fiction 2022, the year of me writing this, beyond its reputation for perversion, it's decidedly square. Maybe a statistically higher concentration of people who are autistic in the fandom, and I say that as a person diagnosed with ASD, but furry fiction is still seen by normies that exist outside of it as a constant source of cringe content, especially on sites like 4chan, Kiwi Farms, and even YouTube. I mean, besides, how many furry rappers can you name? How about furry celebrities? See what I mean? Really, the more people interested in furry fiction means more people interested in making furry fiction, and in turn, they'll give us more great furry fiction. After all, with the furry fandom being known as a group of super creative DIYers for producing great indie content in the age of the internet, really the sky's the limit. As I had to skip a good bit of detail, even with the biggest milestones of furry fiction for the sake of time, including with stuff I forgot to say, like the fact that The Reason Why Mouse, the graphic novel about the Holocaust with different ethnicities and nationalities represented by different species, is so famous because it's the only piece of anthro fiction so far to win the Pulitzer Prize. I also skipped over entire eras of time, such as the medieval era, particularly because I didn't know that there were famous examples of anthrofiction there, the Tales of Reiner the Fox, which are quite complex and well written. However, 2 videos were enough to get one interested and to let the public know that furry fiction is worth exploring, even if you don't call yourself a furry. I mean, Mouse is assigned reading in some classrooms, and works such as Wes Anderson's Fantastic Mr. Fox received advanced critical analysis. It doesn't deserve the genre ghetto it's now in, any more than science fiction deserves its ghetto before works like Dune came out. And hopefully one day, furry fiction will receive hard-won mainstream attention and coolness once it has its own Dune. Until then, I'm Mr. Fiction 1, and I'm glad I told the world about the history of furry fiction.